obviously this isn't what people really do. And often, we still have an idea that there are people who live only without those things, and that's not the case. We're always startled by it when we see these incursions of technology. When I was a younger person, my mom went to the Philippines, and she came home with these great stories of these guys with their VCRs inside palm trees. Basically, they had made nests inside the palm trees, tree houses, if you will, where they fermented their palm wine, and they had VCRs and televisions. This is where they watched their movies. And otherwise, they were basically on this resort wearing loincloths in this special eco resort, you know, where people hung out to be with the natives. And eventually she got bored where the natives couldn't bring her up the tree. He brought their VCR down, but it was kind of, she said it was fun at night. You'd watch the guys shooting up the tree, and they'd get real drunk up there, and then you'd watch them sort of fall out of the tree. The last time I was, where was I? I was in the Dominican Republic, and there was this guy who was selling coconuts on the beach, and he was telling you, you'd point, and he'd say, he'd say, I want the third one on the left, and he would just hit it down with it. And this man had to be 80. All right, like he was no young kid, and he was like $10, and I gave him $10 because I can't do that. Right, that was my rule. I can't do what you just did. I give you the $10. I didn't even want the damn coconut, but the guys next to me who had told him to go get the third one on the right were like, $10? No way, dude, no. And I was like, here's your $10. Give me the coconut. And I'm gonna throw it at him. And I've learned from experiences. When you pluck a coconut real hard, it's not good. All right. So fieldwork talks about the long period of time that you spend with a group that you are studying. Now, fieldwork doesn't always mean that you're going to the islands, right? I've done, now coming up on, oh my gosh, I guess I've been on this group a really long time. I'm coming up on 21 years of studying the same pagan group in San Bernardino. Obviously, I don't spend all of the time with them anymore. I just spend ritual time with them. But when I first started working with them, I basically hung out with them every single day. So when you do field work, what you do during that time is you live as they live. You do something called participant observation. And then at the end, you write an ethnography. The ethnography is that description of the culture. And ethnography is a snapshot in time. It does not say this is how these people will always be. This is how I found these people at the time I went. Right? Because all cultures change. Imagine if someone had come to study Norco, right? Studying at Georgetown, USA, and they had come 20 years ago. Would the things that they had written still apply? Some of them, yes. Many of them, no. Because cultures are not static, right? They're always. I can tell you I'm technologically challenged right now. Everything has gone wrong. Even my computer stopped talking to my printers yesterday at home. I mean, like that's, I don't know if I did something to them. I don't know. All right, so these are your learning outcomes. This is what we're to expect, that at the end, you should know the answers to these questions, right? So make sure that you review those, and then, of course, the PowerPoint's already up. So, what we look at when we talk about ethnographic fieldwork as opposed to sociology, or as opposed to someone doing a psychological examination of a single person. This is a really old picture of fieldwork. I really love that. I swear that's Yadjusek, but I'm not sure. Well, it looks like Yadjusek. There was actually a cross. He was both an anthropologist and a doctor who studied people in New Guinea, looking at cannibalism specifically. He was looking at something called kuru, which was found on the Kobe Forest. And that was, it was a shaking sickness. We now call it Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease here, CJD, but they were getting it very, very, very young, and it had to do with how they were preparing their dead, and women died more often than men. And he went there because of this shaking sickness, and he got to know the people. It's really a very, very cool example of anthropology. anthropology in motion. He didn't get them to change their death rituals, but he got them to change how they prepared for the death and what they did, and then the transmission, of course, dropped. It's also related to scrapie, the disease that sheep get, and mad cow disease, the cows get, and Alzheimer's. They're all related. So, fieldwork, essentially, you gotta start with people, right? Well, plannings and places, of course, but people. So you travel to the community, you live with the people, but first, when you travel to a community, they're just gonna say, well, welcome, stranger, please come live with me. I want to study. Not everybody who you go to study is thrilled with the frickin' idea. They're not all like, oh, I'm honored you Western person has decided to come live with me my way, study my ways. Sometimes they find this very insulting. In the Yucatan Peninsula, there was a mural on a rock pass, which in Maya said that we are not your ethnography. And it was big. It wasn't small. It was basically like, anthropologists go home. And he was like, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a biologist. I'm sorry. So you want to go and you want to participate in the same activities that they do. You have to talk to them directly. You ask them questions about their culture, and of course you're going to look at their daily lives. It isn't just rituals that are important, despite what I've told you about the group that I'm studying, their religion. You want to look at everyday life, not just special life. Remember the poor story of Margaret Mead in the place where the boys were girls and the girls were boys for a month, right? You want to see what everyday life is. You want to understand what their challenges are, what their opportunities are, and that helps you really understand a foreign culture. Now, there are ethical considerations we'll get to. Come back to that. There are rules. But one of the important things is that they have to accept you. Some anthropologists will leave as families, where if a male anthropologist wants to go off and study a foreign culture, he'd probably better take his wife with him. Strange men coming to study are often not welcome. Women who go off on their own would be better traveling with either a husband or a sister, someone who is related to them. First of all, it makes you seem normal. Normal people have families, right? Second of all, you wouldn't want the person being perceived as a threat. And here's my favorite ethnography story gone wrong. Dr. James Bell, he used to teach at Cal State LA. He and I have had before he died, sort of a long and complicated friendship. But he was a very shy person. Imagine being a culture anthropologist who is shy. You think of these things as not going together, but he's a very skilled anthropologist. I think he was looking for a place for himself again where people might not think he was shy. He was African American. His wife was one of the first black VPs of GM. I mean, like he had a neat life. He studied homeless people on Skid Row, and he got scarlet fever. They had to replace part of his bowels with pig bowels. And then he went off to Kenya. He went off to the Tida Hills. What he was going to study in the Tida Hills were children. That's where he was going. He was going to study children. He made arrangements with the government. He even made arrangements with some of the tribal elders before he came. He shows up, and there's always an old woman in the village, right? That's pretty much a guarantee in any village. There's going to be an old woman in the village. Sometimes they're friendly, sometimes they aren't. And in this case, she comes up to him demanding a gift. This is also super common. One of my previous instructors didn't give the gift to the lady, and she cursed him, and he got a disease. It happened. You should read, there's an article about it called A Bad Disease of the Arms. Give the Bruja what she wants. Right, that was the ultimate rule at the end. But with this lady, she demanded a gift also of James, and he said no. Because our ethics say we don't do that. We have this whole list of things we do not do. And one of them is we do not give gifts. We may pay people for their work in exchange, but we do not want to set that up because it gives people motivation to manufacture information. It's not really living with them. I don't pay my neighbors to talk to me, right? That's just not how it works. And she demanded this gift, and he said no. So she told all of the children that he was there to eat their souls. But even though he was black, he was actually a white man. Because he spoke like a white man. So he must actually be a white man inside. He was wearing a black man's skin, but he was a white man. And that he was come to take their souls. And also, the rest of the villagers were kind of like, I'm sorry, a grown man has come here to study our children? I'm not sure that's a good idea, right? And they just invited Uncle Putchie into the village. So every day he goes into the village, and every day the kids scatter. Like he walks in, the screaming of children, and they're gone into the hills. This goes on for 6 months. Not a child will come near him. Not a child will talk to him. 6 months, total doom. All right. After 6 months, he's in his little house. You build your own little house, and he realizes he's going to have to go home. What he came to do, he cannot do. The village will not accept him. And as he's contemplating all of the necessities for going home, one of the village men comes up to him with a stick and says, "They're here, come on," and hands him a stick. Okay, another ethical thing we don't do. We don't get involved in anybody's wars. We take notes, we watch, but we do not pick a side, and we do not get involved. And he decides, following the ethics has gotten me this far, i.e. nowhere. I'm gonna go. So he takes the stick and he follows the guy, and they're running through the cornfield. He loses the guy almost immediately. Now he's in a cornfield with a stick. That's not good. A baboon comes rushing through the corn. Big, scary teeth. Yeah, scary. Baboons are killers. And they don't even have to bite you. They can throw rocks at you and kill you. They do this all the time. Farmers are always in battle with baboons, because baboons will fight over the same water hole, and they will actually crush farmers' skulls by hurling rocks at them. Or taking the farmer's weapon away from them and beating them to death with their own weapon. So there was Jim, standing there with this stick, the baboon, and he goes, he wasn't expecting that. The baboon takes that moment, that opportunity, takes his stick away from him, and beats him unconscious. Baboon just beats him, knocks out his tooth, cracks his skull, beats the shit out of him. And he wakes up, he comes to, and gave him back his stick. I'm not sure why that's so extra insulting, but it's like extra insulting. And I don't need this anymore. So he wakes up, and after he wakes up, he realizes, I'm done for. Like, there's no way. I'm gonna be considered the wimp forever. They'll never let me stay. So he's dragging his sorry ass back to the village. And another warrior comes by who looks really bad. Like, his eyes swollen, he's missing a tooth, he might have a broken arm. And he starts dragging himself next to him as they're kind of going back to the village, and Jim's like, I never made it to the fight. And the guy goes, what happened to you? And he says, I was beaten by a baboon. And the guy goes, yeah, that was the fight. We were trying to keep the baboons out of the corn. That was the fight. He says, and when we get back to the village, we're going to tell everybody there were 20 of them. And other men start coming in from the cornfield, and they are all bleeding, right? Everybody has absolutely, literally had their asses handed to them by a baboon, who gave every single one of them back their stick. Right? And it appears to have been one baboon, right? Not 20 baboons, one baboon systematically went through this village of men, kicked all their asses, and left. So the men looked at each other, and they all silently agreed. There were 20 of them. Right, so when they came back to the village, they were like, there were just too many of them. we were surrounded, and they look at Jim like, I dare you, say something different. Right? And Jim was like, I don't know, I saw, and he names this guy, a baboon that was almost as big as him. And I don't know where he got 2 sticks, but he had 2 sticks. And he starts elaborating on the story, and the guy's just kind of like, shh, that's enough. Like, don't tell the rest of the story. And all the women are like, oh, that's terrible, that's awful. And the elder men were like, yes, from my youth, you know, this happened all the time. But in my youth, we were beat up by 50. And the guy leans in, he goes, it was probably 2. So Jim agrees to go with the lie. And the very next day, he's waiting on his porch, and what should show up on his porch but all of the village children? Because their dads had said, you will talk to that man, he is one of us. And so they asked him, are you really a white guy inside? And he was like, no. And I don't know how to prove that to you, but no. And then he starts taking out pictures of his wife, his kids, his mom, and the kids look at all these pictures and they go, all of your people are black. And he says, yes. He says, well, then you can't be white inside. And he said, no. And then they started talking to him. Then he was okay. So that was part of their daily lives, right? This baboon incursions, they come and on the board, this is all part of it. And he did eventually do a rather robust ethnography on the life of children, which was really unusual at the time. So these are anthropologists doing their work. Yeah, I know that guy looks military. You know why? Because he's military. They're anthropologists in the military. Now, typically, when we talk about ethics and who we report to and what we do, we're not so crazy about anthropologists working within the military. But if you think about it and take it a little further, if they're informing behavior of the military, not using that information to try and figure out how to conquer people better, but using that information to try and figure out how to get peace to happen, how to understand each other, not so bad. So it's not always easy. It's not always stress-free. Sometimes it's pretty awful. And it can be, I don't know, it can be rough. There was a nun who was an anthropologist who studied sex workers, and she ended up becoming a prostitute. A dominatrix, actually. Ultimately, she decided their way of life made more sense than hers. I wasn't there, man. I don't know. But I can't imagine that was a stress-free life, you know, because doing participant observation meant becoming a dominatrix for her.
Would that be considered going native?
She went native. She absolutely went native. And I think we would be less freaked out if she had started off as a nun. Right? If she'd just been like, oh, there was this woman who studied dominatrix and became one, we'd be like, oh, that could be an HBO special. Right? Real sex or whatever it is. But people become attached, right? You go, you live with these people, they often give you a family name. They often make you part of their family. My advisor at UCR still thinks of the Samai he worked with. He still has a brother there and a sister, and they are his brother and his sister. His mom and his dad have passed away, but they're not mom. They're not biological. They're his village mom and dad. And it's very, very hard for fieldwork in itself not to affect the anthropologist. And remember, we're supposed to be neutral, right? It's all about the ethics. We're supposed to remain neutral and report back. But it becomes very, very hard not to become a part of it. You live a life long enough, and the life makes sense, right? The cultural logic makes sense, and it becomes home. Okay, so she's not actually an anthropologist, but how many of you are watching Orange is the New Black? Right, almost all of us. When Piper gets there, she's like, what the hell, right? She's gone to Oz. Right, where we are now, the cultural logic has made sense to her now. And despite the fact that it's prison, she understands the behavior and the cultural logic, and it has become home. She's actually attached to these women and to their situations, in addition to her own. And it's not dissimilar to that. This is different, by the way, than from Stockholm syndrome. Stockholm syndrome, when you get taken captive by somebody and then you start identifying with your captors. Right? It's not that. but it does, you do get very, very entrenched. So, sometimes there is this overwhelming culture shock where the way people do things is so different from the way that you do them. You have nothing familiar, nothing. You really do feel like you've gone to Oz, that you have fallen down the rabbit hole. And for anthropologists, that happens twice. When they arrive and when they arrive back home. Both times, it gets very, very surreal for them. It can be actually quite emotionally difficult to have this idea that nothing will ever be normal again. And then eventually it does become normal, like any situation. The reason I brought up Orange is the New Black is, one could never imagine that prison would become normal. But for Piper, it does. It becomes normal. So it can be rough. Culture shock can be rough. I'm trying to think of another example that's a good one. Well, some of you have traveled, right? When you travel to a new place and you get there and nothing seems normal, nothing, you're experiencing culture shock. It won't be as bad when you get home, because usually when you're traveling to a new place, you're going to be gone for, like, even best case scenario, a month, a couple weeks. These people are gone for years. And it can be quite difficult. I have a friend that I think never came home. I mean, he's been home for years, but I don't think he ever came home. And he studied, he's actually an archaeologist, but he lived with a group of Maya in Guatemala for several years. He lived in a tent. He could have lived inside a building, but he didn't want to, because he's that guy. And he still, I think, has trouble sleeping indoors. You put him in a group of more than 3 people, and he just goes. It's not PTSD, it's culture shock. So, obviously, you can't see and do everything. But you're general. There may be certain things that you don't get to do because the culture says you don't get to do that. Or sometimes it's because you haven't developed trust yet with the people. You may not get to see everything because your trust with the people doesn't develop until later. There are some classic stories about this. Eating Christmas in the Kalahari. It's a story about a guy who lives among the Bushmen, and he decides at the near the end of his fieldwork there that he's going to, for Christmas, which is not obviously only means something to him, it doesn't mean something to everybody there. That's why that song is stupid. It's Christmas. The Christmas in Africa song? Do they know it's Christmas time at all? Why would they? Christmas is not their holiday. We should sing a song about their holiday and see if they're enjoying their holiday, not Christmas. So I think something else. But he gets this, he orders this oxen from basically he goes to another village, he gets what he thinks is the best oxen, and when he gets back, everybody already knows he's doing it, and they start talking about how sad it is, that they're going to have such a terrible feast, because they got such a skinny animal, and I hope that they can at least feed the children on the pathetic bag of bones that he got, and they just keep going on until he's miserable. Absolutely miserable. And then when the oxen actually comes and they feast, everyone's really happy. There's lots of it to go around. And he was like, what? And they said, we didn't want your head to get too big. Because among our people, everyone shares, everyone's equal. Even if you brought a bigger gift to the table, it doesn't make you better. And that's what they were teaching. And they said that the only reason they could teach him that was because they finally trusted him. They finally trusted that he would understand. In fact, actually, the Queen of the Sun under a lot of stress right now. In fact, it was just going on Facebook yesterday about the fact that their reservations are being annihilated by mining. Terrible. So you have to be able to ask the right kinds of questions, which means you really got to listen for a while. You wouldn't want to ask a culturally inappropriate question, like things you don't have to ask until people trust you. But you also you have to ask the question correctly. There's a friend who studied Maasai, and he was looking at their patterns of marriage, and he was trying to get at domestic violence within marriage. Like, was it considered domestic violence? What was it? And he sort of asked the, when did you stop beating your wife question? That's a leading question, right? If you say never, you never stopped beating your wife? I've never beat my wife, right? You've got to ask the question in a way that helps people actually answer them. And creating ethnography questions are actually quite hard. When you create ethnography questions, you have to ask open-ended questions that you can still somehow manage to organize into data you can codify and make regular, right? But they've still got to be open-ended questions. And you don't want to ask leading questions. Like, here's a leading question. Are you a good person? Right? And everyone's like, yeah, I think so. Well, I understand that good people donate to charity. Do you donate to charity? And of course your answer is going to be, yes, of course I donate to charity, because you just set up that you're a good person, good people donate to charity, therefore you will donate to charity, right? Like, you don't want to do that. But sometimes the way you phrase questions, it becomes very difficult. Creating actual ethnographic questions is quite difficult. I just did it, not so just. A few years ago, we wanted to know what level people were volunteering at the school, like volunteering elsewhere, what were they doing within their communities and what were they doing for their communities? And it was really hard not to create a set of leading questions that ultimately, if they answered they didn't do anything, it came up with, you suck as a human being, right? How many hours a week do you volunteer? 0 to 4 didn't look good. A lot of people chose the next one. What I ultimately found out was they actually meant 0 to 4. Right? So you have to be able to develop this trust. And I just sent out a piece of paper, and that wasn't very trusty. So you have to start learning how to see patterns and figure out what is significant, which is how you figure out what the right questions are. So some anthropologists see this as sort of an art form, right? Being able to see the pattern, being able to figure out the forest is there instead of focusing on the individual tree, right? Being able to see the forest and trees you know you can. So most anthropologists who can create these brilliant ethnographies really are in some ways artists. Not the same way a fiction writer is an artist, but possibly like an assemblage artist. Like people put stuff together they found and make art. I kind of think of them as assemblage artists. All right, so in our normal everyday lives, we do not keep track of every single thing around us, right? We cannot. I told you last week about body ritual among the Nasarema, right? We don't look at our lives that way. We don't look at hog bristle brushes in our mouths as being weird, that we're trying to chase away mouth demons twice a day. Oh, those darn mouth demons, right? We don't look at it that way. So being able to think like an anthropologist and viewing what you consider normal from an outsider's point of view is difficult. That's why we read this article, The Body Ritual Among the Nasarema, which, by the way, if you want to read it, it's easily Googleable. It's by Horace Miner, and Miner is M-I-N-E-R. And Horace Miner, my house, where's that Miner? I live in the Miner house. I think it's M-I-N-E-R. Horace Miner, and it's called Body Ritual Among the Nasarema. And he basically takes what's normal and makes it seem strange. So being able to do this within our own daily lives is actually quite difficult. So if you wanted to think about all the people who affect your daily life and all the lives that you affect, just let us consider, yesterday might have been weird because it was Sunday, so Let's look at last Thursday. I'm having trouble remembering last Thursday. Hang on. Last Thursday, what did you do? Where's school? And did you talk to anybody? Right, maybe you don't really remember. They weren't really incidences in your life. Did anybody ask you something who was in a class with you about something? Yeah, right? And so you helped that person with information, right? And of course you were in a class, so that instructor was instructing you. So they were affecting your lives. And actually, by the way, we feed off of you like some sort of crazy vampire when it comes to energy. So you were affecting ours as well. And what else? Did you go to the store? Right, so you went to a place where you purchased things for your life which affected other people's lives. What if you bought a Coke, right? We already figured out how you're affecting people in India when you bought a Coke. What if you went and you bought a new pair of jeans affecting kids in China? People you didn't even think about, it's just part of your day. I went to the nail salon and I had my nails done. And so I was employing someone to do a job I can't quite do myself for whatever reason I have never been able to figure out. I can't do it. And so I was affecting their lives. There were two different people because there was someone doing my toes and someone doing my hands. Okay. But I was also using nail polish, which somebody had to make. In a factory, and nail polish is toxic. Right? Somebody got sick because of me. Oh, okay. But I taught a class that morning. When I taught a class that morning, I got an email before I came to class. And that email was from a student who told me I changed their entire life. I always take those with a grain of salt. I mean, they're wonderful, they're wonderful. I don't think it changed your entire life. I might have changed how you look at things, okay. But I don't think it changed your whole life. Your car's not different because of me. The people you love are not different because of me. You just changed a part. It's gratifying, it's wonderful, but it's also a little dramatic, right? So when you think about those kind of things, how I touch your life, you touch my life, and then you touch someone else's life, and you supported someone, and you've not supported something else. Right? I didn't go to Hobby Lobby. I wanted to, but we won't go there. I have stained glass supplies I can keep. I'd rather drive to San Bernardino and buy them from someone else than buy them from Hobby Lobby because they affect people's lives every day. So this is all back and forth. Now imagine trying to be a person doing field work with us. How do you decide what's important? Right? What is important? And there's a lot. There's an awful lot. All right. Okay, Master Ray, you should answer this question. You don't have a degree. It's not anthropology. Now we're going to be looking at what we call salvage ethnography versus ethnographies that take place at multiple locations, digital ethnographies, and traditional ethnographies. All right, so salvage ethnography. Franz Boas, in some ways, was one of the first salvage ethnographers. So in the late 1800s, he started noticing, or like most people had, this wasn't new, that there were multiple Native American groups that were coming down to 10 people, 5 people, 2 people, where whole nations had suffered and were sinking down to a single or very few individuals, tribe maybe that was left. And so he was trying to, as fast as possible, record as much as possible about the native groups before they disappeared. And looking at their norms, their values, and he also, because he was very interested in physical traits, he also looked at things like, what they looked like. So this kind of salvage ethnography was actually very much the focus of American anthropology in the beginning. Very much hurry, hurry, hurry before they go away. And we have some ethnographies of individuals who were the last people of their cultural group. You may have even read something, the Island of the Blue Dolphin, about that last woman, or Ishi, about this last Native American. They actually stuck in a museum in San Francisco. So we have these attempts to try and recover what we can. And The idea being that some descendants that may still exist might wish to take their culture back up again. They might need to know what it was. Now, most Native Americans do not view this as a good thing. This jump into study was, again, done without their permission. Things like collecting their languages before the last speaker died were not always done with the group's permission, and they don't look at it the same way the anthropologist does. Some recordings of the last speaker have been claimed by Native American groups that this is ours, you can't have it, you don't study it, it's not for you. Well, we did the recording, yeah, against our permission, US back tapes. And I understand their point of view. They didn't volunteer to be lab rats, right? And even if we had the best intentions, which we did, it's not necessarily okay to do it without their permission. We sometimes call this urgent anthropology, where something has to be done so very, very quickly before it's all lost. Now, there have been, of course, some successes in this, where languages were saved, where cultural habits were documented, and then the peoples who are the descendants have gone back to the old ways based on the writings of the anthropologists. Multi-sided ethnography is when you have, instead of sort of going to a place, you're actually looking at multiple places. You're looking at peoples who are embedded in larger structures. So they're not necessarily subcultures, but they may exist in different locales, and they may exist in different times. We may be comparing the same culture across time and space and looking at them. They may have geographically spread out, or they may be the same location, but we're looking at them 150 years ago to now. So we may be doing that kind of multi-sided ethnography. Digital ethnography is really becoming a thing. Boy, is it becoming a thing. It's called cyber ethnography. Sometimes it's called netography, which is doing ethnographies of the net. Every day there are anthropologists who are trolling Facebook, who are, there was one anthropologist who figured out the lolcat speech, diagrammed it, figured out what the rules were. There is an anthropologist who devotes herself entirely to 4chan. I feel so sorry for her. Right? She was one of the first people they interviewed on the BBC during the fappening. That happened. Right, so she was right there front and center because she's an anthropologist and she was studying how people in this community view privacy. So that is, for a lot of anthropologists, they're not even leaving their house. They're only ever going into virtual space. There's in your book, you have a little section right there. It says social networking and how fashion spreads globally. You definitely have to read that. Now, of course, there's traditional ethnography. This guy is a famous ethnographer, Branislaw Malinowski. That's him. Obviously, you can tell which one he is. Right? So he lived in the Trobriand Islands, which is a connected series of islands in the South Pacific. He was there for over 20 years. He was there for a very long time. Some of it was because there were wars going on. Some of it wasn't entirely welcome where he was. And he really, really took participant observation very, very seriously. Because of him, we know about things like the origin of Trobriand cricket, Trobriand cricket. So the Trobriand Islanders, the men played a game. This game was, it's a spear, you have two sides lined up, and one guy throws a spear at the other guy. By the way, this is within your village. This is not between enemies. These people are your friends. And the guy has to dodge the spear, but he has to leave 1 foot on the ground. right? So he can dodge the spear however he wants, but it has to be 1 foot on the ground, and he has to pick the foot before the spear is thrown. Right. Obviously, some people did not survive the game. Well, when the British came, and they were, as they put it, they came to pacify the islands. These were warlike people, and part of what they used as proof that these people were savages was this game, right? Grown men throw spears at their friends. So being Brits, what they do, they said, hey, we've got a game that you'll like a lot. It's called cricket. So they taught them cricket. I don't know if you've ever played cricket. It is dissimilar to baseball. It is not baseball. It is an entirely different thing unto itself. Probably the closest you've got to cricket is in Shaun of the Dead and watching zombies get whacked with a cricket bat. Yeah, or lawn bowling is kind of not dissimilar to cricket. Well, the men were like, yeah, that's okay. But you know what would make this game better? Spears, right? You're already way ahead of them, right? This game would be so much better with spears. So they use snowballs at all. They only use spears. Trobrian cricket is a thing unto itself now. And they let the women play, since now they weren't playing with spears anymore. The women are actually really, really good cricket players. But they, again, play by their own rules, and some of the rules involve hitting someone else with the cricket ball. So it's a little bit, it's not that part like baseball where you can throw the ball at somebody. You can do that in their cricket. And you can tell when they got television because their cricket outfits, the ladies' cricket outfits, look just like tennis outfits, like Wimbledon tennis outfits. They still don't wear shirts. That's out. Shirts are out. And in that climate, you wouldn't want shirts anyway. But they wear these little tiny, really small grass skirts that are all the way thick, but they're like these little, and in their hair, they put these little sweatbands in their hair that they make. They usually have like a disc or something on them. Because John McEnroe used to wear this. And so they've adopted what they think is interesting. Very, very good time. What's really sad about Malinowski is that after he died, his memoirs were published, and it turned out he hated everybody. I think that broke every single one of our hearts. We were like, what? It turned out there were some things he said in his own writings to himself that were very unpleasant. But the things that he wrote that were public was some really good ethnography. Really, really, really good ethnography. And he really, I think, formed how participant observation worked, because Boaz was like, come into a culture, start asking questions, write everything down, be the documentarian, right? Take all the pictures, take all the measurements, write everything down you can write. But you have to know what questions to ask, and then live with them. He was basically swooping in, trying to make a recording of this culture. Malinowski, I like to stay. And by living in the daily lives, he got a really, really great idea of what it was like to be interpreted. He also had this complicated exchange system of bracelets and necklaces that are cooling, and we know so much about them because of him. E. Evans Pritchard lived among them where? He sort of becomes the father of what we call structural functionalism. This is this idea that that cultural logic, the reasons that people have for doing what they do within a culture, is usually functional. It's about perpetuating the culture. And so his way of looking at it as a structural functionalist, that instead of it's just these are things that these people do, it's these are things that these people do because this supports this, so it's got a reason. Was also kind of new. He did tons and tons of work among the where. This is him as a very young man. He's an Englishman. In Cambridge, they have a whole wing that's just devoted to stuff that he brought back, and you can hear him narrating it. It's very, very cool. He definitely looked at how people did things. He not only had a cultural logic, but supported that culture in continuing to be a culture. So he looked at kinship systems, which were very complex. and he looked at political systems, and the politics and the kinship of the where are woven together. By making this sort of systematic way of looking at it, it became a lot easier to look at multiple different people's ethnographies and compare them. I mean, think about this before a system is set up. I send you to somewhere and I say, tell me about the people. I send someone else, tell me about the people. Now I want to read across. How do I even know you're going to pick up on the same things? How am I going to compare them? I might not. But Pritchard starts kind of laying out the big things we care about. Like, it's actually the way the previous textbook we used to use in this class was organized. So, what was your kinship? What are your marriage patterns? How do you get food? What is your political organization? What are your gender roles? And how is your culture changing? Like these were the components you always wanted to look at. And that really, I think, helped us. From that, we get something called the HRAF files, the Human Resource Area Files, which are a compilation of ethnographies, pretty much from the beginning of ethnographies to now. And so you can run marriage and get what is said about marriage in each of these. And you can actually do it by culture areas, like marriage in New Guinea. I want to compare marriage in New Guinea and marriage in Finland. I want to look among Laplanders in Finland, people who herd reindeer. I want to look at reindeer herders, and I want to look at I'm going to look at cow herders in Uganda, and I'd like to know what they have in common. And the Human Resource Area Files let you do that. We have access to them here. They're called the HRAF files, and any university that you belong to will absolutely have them. When I was in your shoes, they didn't exist. They were being built, but nobody could afford a computer at home, and that's how old I am. And when they finally came to Cal State Fullerton, I remember, I was the only one cheering, but I was cheering because this giant disc set of CDs had come. And CDs were still a pretty cool idea for a computer. Oh, it wasn't going to be floppy disks. And I actually remember when floppy disks actually flopped. You guys have seen those little square ones? They came bigger. They looked like a record, and they were soft, and you could wheel them like this. And they actually came even bigger than that, but they were about this big. So when you carried your floppy disk that had all of your storage on it, by the way, at that point, 10 kilobytes was awesome, awesome floppy disk. That was very large. I remember someone bought one. It was like, oh my God, you'll never use that up. You can't even get a picture of a cat on that. Let alone a picture of a cat doing something cool. No. So Margaret Mead, she was really into, she was the one who sort of made those mistakes. But once she got better, she started really looking at how females were affected in cultures, because being female, that's what she had access to. She finally realized somewhere along the lines that how we're enculturated and the things that we think of as being biological associated with adolescence are not necessarily biological. Some of them are entirely cultural. Like this sort of weird awkwardness that we experience as teenagers in some cultures is either truncated or doesn't exist. Now, you say, no, some of them are biological. It's actually how we interpret them. When I was a teenager, I grew weird because I have a sort of rare set of gene combinations. My parents weren't cousins, but they might as well have been. And I had 2 puberties. Yeah, remember how much fun puberty was? Imagine having it happen to you twice. So I'm 13 and puberty hits. Puberty. And I went through that awkward phase, and my parents called it the awkward phase. Right, my dad sometimes referred to me as a deer. I think that was his nice way of putting it. My mother had other much less nice ways of putting it, because my limbs grew in length quite a lot. I didn't have any additional weight gain, though, that came with being female. I didn't gain any weight. So I remained the same weight, and then I grew. So I was all arms and legs and neck. I never did grow a big head. I ever did a tiny head. I know this, it's okay. But I was like this, right? I was like this for 10 years. Not quite. 8 years. I was like this for 8 years. I was almost 21 when the second period. I thought I was dying. I really did, because I grew 2 inches in 2 months. That's not a good time. That was painful. And then I looked like a girl. You know, all that finally happened. I'd already met the man who was going to be the father of my child, right? And like from before his very eyes, I went from boy to woman. A little boy. I told a little boy. So that whole teenage time, my parents were like, don't worry. And by the time I hit 18, they were like, oh, you're just going to be awkward forever. Right? You know, oh, I guess you're not going to grow into that body. It's just, you know, like a puppy who's got these giant feet, and you're like, oh, that's going to be a big puppy. I just turned into this muppet. And I wasn't even very tall. I was like 5'6", but it just looked so funny. And it was the way my culture kept describing it. There were a couple of people who were like, oh, I guess you're willowy. Oh, you're like a model, except for your skin. Teenager. Skin. Hard. Right? And of course, braces. Really had a lot going for me. And the way my culture harped on it and harped on it and harped on it and harped on it, it was a constant description of my being. Right? I was that skinny chick with braces. Constantly. What Margaret Mead found out, we're talking about like 30s and 40s, is that just doesn't happen in other cultures. They understand that you go through a little bit of biological awkwardness, but they didn't even see it the same way. Like, they don't take note when your arms suddenly do a thing and the rest of you not so much. They just don't comment on it. It's not important. Just like your parents didn't comment on every single pimple you ever had, I hope. It just wasn't important. And, you know, it is what it is. Now, did I change as a parent? Did I not do it? No, I totally did it too. Couldn't help it. I'm a member of my culture. I kept teasing my son. I was like, oh, he looks like Jar Jar Binks. It had to do with the way he walked. So I was like, with these super long arms and these super long legs, and I now understood why my parents could not refrain from commenting. I'm here for these second period going to suck. All right, so Annette Weiner, she gets very little play in terms of talking about famous anthropologists. We tend to talk about the same ones from a long time ago over and over again. Annette Weiner is from the 1970s and the 1980s. So to me, that's a long time ago. But you know, when the anthropologists who are typically teaching, that was when they were going to school, so she wasn't hardly important at all. You talked about the forefathers. I'm from the next generation after that, and she looked at what we call reflexivity. So we're looking at feminism here, and we're looking at reflexivity. So basically, she went to the Turbrian Islands to return to where Malinowski had been studied. So going back to a place that had been well documented. And what she found out was that a whole bunch of stuff had been missed. Because who was Malinowski talking to? Did you see him sitting with a woman? No. That wasn't his place. He was with a man, right? And so what he learned about the Turbrians was completely from a male perspective. Not from a female perspective at all. Kathleen Go, I don't know if she's Go at all, but she went down to the north, where Evans Pritchard had been. And basically what they found out was these beautiful, detailed ethnographies were half the story. Right? The other half of the story had not been told. The other half of the story, which was about women, and then also about children, which is one of the reasons that Jim Bell goes when he goes. Jim Bell did his work in Tidal Hills in the 80s, right? It was basically anthropologists looked up and went, oh, we forgot about women. And then a bunch of them looked up and went, crap, what about kids? And they started looking at them, although I would say the anthropology into children is not as robust as it should be. Every culture has gender roles. What Margaret Mead was trying to get at was that they were not biologically based. And then she was absolutely right, they're not biologically based. There are a couple of jobs that are specific to genders, not even genders, are specific to sex, right? Don't get to have babies unless you have a uterus. That's the rule. Does that mean you can't be a mother? No, absolutely does not mean that. We're talking about the physical process of lactating, the physical process of having a uterus. That's making babies, right? But beyond that, it doesn't mean that the woman is the primary caregiver. It doesn't mean the woman is going to be the secondary breadwinner. None of those things are the case. And if you really want to understand that, we really do need to look across cultures and see how other cultures handle it. How do other cultures deal? So, and obviously this is not terribly surprising. You can't expect male anthropologists to get a major grip on what is going on with the girls. You couldn't be a female participant observer. A man doesn't have a menstrual cycle, right? In many cultures, women, while they're menstruating, are separated off from the group into a menstrual hut. Some menstrual huts, by the way, have cable. It's not all like, oh, I'm unclean. Some women seem to have their period in those cultures, at least for multiple days within each week. Because you can't do any child care during that time either. You can't prepare any food because you're dirty. So you go to the menstrual hut with your cable. But no, I mean, like if you're a male anthropologist and you want to study women, what are you going to do when it's time to go to the menstrual hut? You're going to cut yourself? And what are you going to do? You're stuck outside. So anthropologists really took this to heart and realized they had made a major oversight. So then they started looking at what other areas they didn't see. And that's when they figure out they're not looking at kids, right? They're not even looking at the contributions that children make to culture. So Barbara Meyerhoff, she crosses lots of places. Barbara Meyerhoff works in religion and all kinds of places. But basically, what she says is that if we're talking about the development of anthropology, is that we have to turn around and study our own cultures. We actually do. We have to look at anthropology. And when Meyerhoff went off to study Native Americans, she was looking at Native American groups in New Mexico. She was looking specifically at rituals, but she spent time with them long term. When she came back, no, she wasn't on the moon. She was in New Mexico and Mexico. She was in both with a group that crosses. So she was there. She comes back, and she's like, "Oh my God." Her culture shock, that part of returning, allowed her to see her own culture as an ethnographer. So then she started looking at the elderly, another group that gets missed typically. So she is a young Jewish woman, starts living with older male and female Jewish women and men, and she starts seeing what she considers what previously had been familiar as strange. And she called, the ethnography was called Number Our Days. So she was looking at a group of people who were at the end stage of their lives. What were their values? What were their practices? What was their everyday life like? And so she actually really helps us by illuminating the sort of power we have of basically telling the story. Because that's not a story we normally have. I mean, how many opportunities do you have to go spend time living with people who are going to die? And you have full lives on the way. right? They've got stories, they've got things they need to tell you, and we just really don't pay very much attention to that because we think of them culturally as they're just old people, right? That's what they are. And she really looked at them closely.